Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got a stack of source material here today shared by one of you, our listeners, and honestly, it takes us right into the cutting edge and maybe unsettling world of China's military technology.
It really does.
And the material kicks off with something that, well, it really grabbed my attention. One report mentions China unveiling what they're calling the world's first AI nuclear inspector.
Hmm.
Now, the sources say specifics are classified, obviously, but just that idea, AI in the nuclear sphere, it's quite a starting point.
It is, and it signals exactly what this deep dive is really about. It's not just one gadget, is it? It's this broader, accelerating push by China to weave advanced tech, like AI, into their military and, what that actually means for everyone else.
Exactly. So our mission today is to work through this material you sent in.
Yeah.
We've got reports on SME weapons, high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, that is, analyses of how China gets and reverse engineers tech, and these broader takes on their military growth. And we want to pull out the essential insights for you so you can really understand what's going on and, frankly, why it matters.
Okay, let's do it.
So let's start with these HEP weapons. Sounds a bit like science fiction, but the sources describe a very real capability. What exactly is a HEP weapon based on this material?
Okay, so the core of it is actually a nuclear warhead, but the key difference is where it detonates, not on the ground.
Right.
It's detonated way up high. The sources mention a range, something like 30 to 400 kilometers altitude.
Okay, so way above the atmosphere mostly. So it's not about the blast damage down here.
Exactly. The main weapon isn't the blast, it's the pulse. This intense burst of electromagnetic radiation, long wavelength radio frequency energy that floods out from the detonation.
And that pulse can damage electronics.
Damage or disrupt them, yeah. Over a potentially huge area. We're talking massive.
And there's this fascinating detail about how China classifies these things. It uses a nuke, but they don't call it a nuclear weapon.
This is really critical, according to the analysts in these sources. The PRC apparently views HEMPs as an extension of information warfare, cyber warfare, essentially, not as a traditional nuclear weapon.
Even though it starts with a nuclear detonation.
Correct. And that framing, that classification is seen as really significant. It might imply, a different threshold for actually using it compared to a typical nuclear strike.
That definitely blurs some lines, doesn't it? How does the pulse itself actually work? The sources mention different phases.
Yeah, they break it down into three main phases, E1, E2, and E3, they call them. Phase 1, or E1, is incredibly fast nanoseconds. It creates these huge voltage surges that can just fry circuits, instant electrical failure.
So that's the really damaging part.
That's the one that causes the most direct permanent damage, yeah. Then phase 2, or E2, lasts milliseconds. It's more like a lightning strike in terms of voltage. It can temporarily disable things. And phase 3, E3, is slower seconds to minutes. They compare it to a massive solar storm. Again, more likely to cause temporary disruption rather than permanent burnout, but still a problem.
And the range, the potential footprint of this pulse, depending on that altitude, it's kind of mind-boggling.
It really is staggering. The sources say a detonation at, say, 30 kilometers up could create a pulse radius of 600 kilometers.
Wow.
But push that altitude up to 400 kilometers, and the radius explodes to 2,200 kilometers.
2,200 kilometers. That's huge.
Yeah, the reports point out that from that height, a single burst could potentially cover most of the continental U.S.
And it also mentions something about the warhead yield, that it doesn't necessarily make the pulse stronger.
Right, that's an interesting point. The yield primarily affects the radius, the coverage area, not necessarily the peak strength of the pulse at any given point within that radius.
Okay, that's counterintuitive. And the delivery seems simpler, too. Less complex than getting a warhead accurately onto a ground target.
That's another point raised, yeah. Because the effect is so widespread, you don't need pinpoint accuracy. Plus, unlike a warhead hitting the ground, it doesn't need a heavy-duty reentry vehicle to survive coming back through the atmosphere.
Ah, okay.
Which, theoretically, could make it harder for some current anti-ballistic missile systems to intercept. Fewer technical hurdles for the attacker.
Okay, so we know what it is, how it works. Let's get into the consequences. This is where it gets, well, pretty concerning reading through this material.
Yeah.
What do the sources say would happen?
The potential impacts are just profound across the board. Military, civilian, everything. For modern militaries. Utterly dependent on digital systems, right?
Completely.
Command, control, communications, navigation, targeting, it's all electronic. A HEMP attack could be instantly debilitating. Think of all those semiconductors and weapons, radios, computers. They're conductive, very vulnerable.
So that's like hitting the entire nervous system of a modern military all at once.
That's a good way to put it. Command and control could just evaporate or degrade so badly that operational effectiveness plummets. For any advanced force, it's a nightmare scenario.
But it doesn't stop at the military.
Not at all. That's where the potential for truly widespread chaos comes in, according to these reports. Civilian infrastructure, especially the electrical grid in developed countries.
Highly automated, interconnected.
Exactly. Very reliant on electronic controls. A SHEM CEPI could trigger widespread component failures, leading to cascading blackouts, not just local, but potentially paralyzing huge regions.
And almost everything relies on electricity these days.
Which is how you get to these warnings about potential societal collapse. The sources talk about all 16 critical infrastructure sectors: transport, finance, food, water, that they all need power, or the electronic systems managing them.
Can you give us a couple of specific examples from the reports? Stark ones.
Sure. Telecommunications. Knock that out. And coordinating emergency response becomes incredibly difficult. Even basic communication just stops.
Right.
Food supply. Think about refrigeration logistics systems. Widespread power loss means massive food spoilage. That could lead very quickly to shortages, maybe even famines, civil unrest if it goes on long enough.
And water.
Same problem. Water systems rely heavily on electric pumps. Automated valves for treatment, for delivery, disrupt that and you lose access to clean water. Huge public health crisis potential. People start drinking unsafe water, disease spreads.
And the threat isn't just ground level either. The sources mention space systems.
They do. HMPs are also very effective against satellites. There's this historical example they bring up, the U.S. Starfish prime test back in 1962.
Ah, yes, I remember reading about that.
A high-altitude nuclear test. It actually accidentally damaged several satellites in orbit because of the energy it released. It was an unexpected side effect, but it showed just how vulnerable space assets are.
And losing satellites would cripple a modern military like the U.S.
Severely hamper it, absolutely. Reconnaissance, navigation like GPS, precision targeting. So much relies on space. Take that away, and battlefield effectiveness drops dramatically. Russia also reportedly has weapons designed to do this too, by the way.
So are there defenses against HMP? What did the sources say?
Well, the main defense discussed is physical shielding, basically putting critical electronics inside Faraday cages, shielded rooms, boxes made of metal or conductive concrete.
Like a vault for electronics.
Sort of, yeah. But you obviously can't shield everything. Antennas, sensors, things that need to interact with the outside world, they're still vulnerable.
So what do you do about those?
The recommendation seems to be stocking plenty of spare parts. Be ready to replace things quickly after an event. The sources also mention a U.S. executive order from 2019 that was aimed at coordinating efforts to mitigate HMQ risks across the country. So it's definitely on the radar.
It sounds like defenses are possible, but protecting an entire nation's infrastructure comprehensively would be a monumental challenge.
Absolutely monumental. And the potential cost of failure. Well, some experts quoted in the material use pretty stark language.
Like what?
Calling electromagnetic weapons a potential civilization killer, warning that millions of lives could be at risk, depending on how bad an attack is and how unprepared society is.
Wow. Okay, so given this capability, this potential impact, how does China actually view Hepanoplane? How does it fit into their strategic thinking, their military doctrine?
The sources are pretty consistent on this. The PRC leadership seems to view HIPMIs primarily as a critical cyber weapon.
Cyber, again, not nuclear.
Right. Their doctrine heavily emphasizes what they call information-centric warfare.
Right.
And the main goal with HEPNEL in this view is achieving information superiority by disabling the adversary's command and control, taking out the brain and nervous system, electronically speaking, to gain the upper hand right at the start.
In this thinking, it links back to their analysis after the first Gulf War, doesn't it?
It does, very directly. Watching the U.S. military's high-tech dominance in that conflict was apparently a wake-up call. PLA doctrine shifted. Documents like The Science of Military Strategy started emphasizing information-based local war.
Okay.
There's a quote mentioned, something like, "The victory of the war begins with the victory of cyberspace." They saw the reliance on electronics as a potential Achilles heel for advanced militaries.
And we see this reflected in recent changes to the PLA's structure, too.
Seems like it. The recent reorganization, replacing the Strategic Support Force with new branches like the Aerospace Force, Cyberspace Force, and Information Support Force, it underscores this intense focus on infowar, cyber ops, electronic warfare.
So command over things like MP is likely now with these new forces.
Probably distributed, yeah, but the Cyberspace Force would likely play a central role. It fits the classification.
The Science of Military Strategy also talks about different types of cyber attacks.
Yes. It distinguishes between soft destruction, things like hacking, jamming, disrupting data, and traditional hard destruction, which means physical damage.
And hemfitzware.
The sources suggest HEMTI is seen as a kind of bridge between the two. It can cause temporary disruption, like soft destruction, but also permanent physical damage to electronics, like hard destruction.
Which brings us to this term, assassin's mace. What's that about?
Right. The PLA apparently classifies hemp as an assassin's mace weapon, or shishujian. The term itself refers to, like, a hidden weapon, maybe a spiked club, something unexpected that a weaker opponent could use to deliver a decisive blow against a stronger one.
So it's fundamentally about asymmetry, leveling the playing field.
Exactly. It's seen as a tool to negate a technologically superior enemy's advantage, cripple their advanced electronics quickly, decisively. There's another quote mentioned, calling cyber attacks the trump card for a weak country to deal with a powerful country.
Interesting.
The sources even draw a parallel to Sun Tzu's, talking about using fire attacks in the art of war to cause chaos and disruption as an ancient form of asymmetric warfare.
And surprise is key to this doctrine.
Absolutely critical. PLA writings, like the lectures on joint campaign information operations mentioned in the sources, really stress sudden, coordinated attacks to achieve strategic surprise.
And HMP is perfect for that.
It's seen as a prime tool for it, yeah. Especially hitting command and control right at the outset. There's even a reference to a 1996 PLA newspaper article envisioning a surprise attack on information systems being like a Pearl Harbor incident of the 21st century.
Does this thinking apply to specific scenarios, like Taiwan?
Very much so, according to these sources. Reports from Taiwan, like their defense review, and analyses from their military colleges explicitly flag a nuclear EMP strike as a key asymmetric scenario they need to prepare for.
They see it as a real possibility.
Some analyses apparently see it as maybe the only way China could achieve a truly paralyzing first strike in certain situations. And Taiwan's reportedly taken steps, like shielding critical facilities, in response.
Okay, so if China views HMP as cyber, despite the nuclear component, how does that square with their official no first use policy for nuclear weapons?
Yeah. That's where it gets really, really murky. And it's a major point in these analyses. China declared no first use back in 1964, right? Said nukes were only for deterring or responding to a nuclear attack.
But their doctrine encourages preemptive cyber strikes.
Exactly. So the massive question these sources raises, if HMP is officially classified as cyber, does that mean the no first use pledge simply doesn't apply, even though it involves detonating a nuclear warhead?
That's a huge loophole, potentially.
It could be interpreted that way. And many analysts argue that this classification deliberately lowers the threshold for deploying such a weapon. It increases the risk of a conventional conflict suddenly escalating because a cyber weapon with nuclear origins is used.
And this is happening while China's nuclear arsenal is growing rapidly.
Right. The Pentagon estimates vary, but they all point to a significant increase, potentially hundreds more warheads by 2035.
Maybe even over 1,000, some projections suggest.
And the point made in the material is that every one of those warheads is potentially a HEP-MP weapon. This suggests to some observers a possible shift in posture, maybe moving beyond purely strategic deterrence towards seeing these capabilities as usable for battlefield advantage or coercion.
Does their concept of active defense play into this?
It does. Active defense in PLA doctrine isn't just about defending. It explicitly allows for preemptive actions to fend off perceived threats.
So striking first is okay under certain circumstances.
Under their definition, yes. And the U.S. DoD assessment, mentioned in the sources, is that China might consider using nuclear weapons even in response to a non-nuclear attack. Yeah. If that attack seriously threatens their forces or their command and control, or achieves effects that China considers strategic in impact, that thinking seems to potentially contradict a strict no-first-use policy.
And new delivery systems, like the DF-26 missile or hypersonics, make a first strike more feasible.
They certainly add to the picture, yeah. Dual-capable missiles like the DF-26 conventional or nuclear, able to reach places like Guam, plus hypersonic weapons designed for speed and evasion. They provide potential means to deliver a HEMTech warhead quickly, maybe with little warning, That enhances the first strike potential.
So putting it all together, the blurry cyber classification, the bigger arsenal, the doctrine allowing preemption, the new missiles, it sounds like it really chips away at the old Cold War logic of mutually assured destruction, man.
That's a key conclusion drawn in several of these sources, yes. These developments are seen as potentially eroding the stability that man, theoretically, provided.
Oh,
So making nuclear-enabled weapons seem potentially more usable, less purely about deterrence. It risks creating a security dilemma where China's actions are seen as offensive, prompting the U.S. and allies to react, leading to an escalatory cycle, an arms race dynamic, basically.
Okay, so given all this ambiguity, how might the U.S. respond to an attempt attack? The sources suggest that's also unclear.
Very unclear. And interestingly, it's pointed out that some U.S. military documents also classify HEMP effects under the electromagnetic spectrum, not purely as nuclear warfare, kind of mirroring the Chinese framing in some ways.
Oh.
And the 2022 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, for example, apparently doesn't specifically mention HEMP, so there's ambiguity on the U.S. side too.
If it doesn't fit neatly into the nuclear attack box, how do you decide on a proportional response?
That's the core dilemma. U.S. doctrine for responding to cyber attacks is quite broad. It allows for a range of responses, potentially including nuclear weapons, if a non-nuclear attack is deemed strategic level.
But who defines strategic level?
Yes.
Especially for an attack that's electronic.
Exactly, it's subjective. Could a HEMP attack that cripples national command and control or takes out the power grid be interpreted as strategic? Quite possibly, under some frameworks that could theoretically justify a nuclear response.
Even tactical attacks could blur into strategic.
Yeah, the sources mention that. Taking out satellites, for instance. Might seem tactical initially, but given the global reliance on space assets, the effects could easily be strategic.
So bottom line, the U.S. response is uncertain.
That's the takeaway from the material. There isn't necessarily clear, established institutional guidance for this specific scenario, especially given the cyber framing. The actual response would likely depend heavily on the specifics, the scale of the attack, how prepared the U.S. is, and ultimately, how senior leaders interpret the event in the heat of the moment.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, though it's all connected. How has China managed to advance its military tech so quickly in some areas? The sources point strongly towards, well, reverse engineering and other forms of acquisition.
This is a huge theme running through the material, yeah. A lot of China's most talked about military systems come with this. Let's call it a shadow of reverse engineering accusations.
And the sources list quite a few examples. Let's maybe walk through some of the main ones they cite.
Okay. One classic example often mentioned is the F-117 stealth fighter that was shot down over Yugoslavia in 1999.
Right.
Reports suggest China acquired parts of the wreckage, studied the shape, the radar-absorbent materials. Later, there were sightings reported in China of things that looked suspiciously like F-117 components or even replicas. And the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade happened amidst all sorts of rumors about this, though the official reasons were different.
Then there was the stealth Black Hawk from the bin Laden raid.
Yes, the modified helicopter that crash-landed in Pakistan in 2011. Sources allege Pakistan gave China access to the wreckage.
And the result?
Well, shortly after, China unveiled its Harbin Z-20 helicopter, which, visually looks remarkably similar to a Black Hawk, especially considering the timing and the alleged access to the stealth variant wreckage.
What about their advanced fighters? The J-20 gets compared to U.S. planes a lot.
It does. It's often described by analysts as looking like a mashup of the F-22 and F-35. But beyond just looks, Russian sources have publicly claimed the J-20 is based on their canceled MiG 1.44 project and initially relied heavily on Russian engines. There are even specific, though anonymously sourced allegations mentioned that China got hold of Mikoyan design documents somehow.
And the other stealth fighter, the FC-31.
Similar story. Striking visual resemblance to the F-35, particularly the F-35B naval version, even though it's twin-engine. The sources highlight specific shared features like the DSI air intakes, the canopy shape, the things that the diners point to as suspiciously similar.
The pattern seems to extend beyond fighters, too.
Yeah.
Transport planes, drones.
Absolutely. The Y-20 heavy airlifter is brought up. Visually, it's often called a C-17 lookalike, even if performance differs.
Is there evidence beyond looks?
Well, the sources connect it to the Su Bin cyber espionage case. He was convicted of stealing vast amounts of data from Boeing, including, reportedly, over 65 gigabytes specifically on the C-17. That data allegedly went to Xi'an Aircraft, the Y-20 manufacturer. China denies it, but the link is often drawn.
And drones.
Yeah, the CC, CH-4, and CH-5 drones, they look incredibly similar to the US MQ-9 Reaper, the nose turret, the V-tail, the wing shape, even the dimensions. Though performance is generally considered less capable in the Chinese versions, and their CH-7 concept looks a lot like the experimental US X-47B stealth drone.
Any other platforms mentioned frequently?
Let's see. The KJ-600, their new carrier-based radar plane airborne early warning, it looks almost identical to the U.S. Navy's E-2 Hawkeye, very important for their new aircraft carrier, the Fujin. The J-10 fighter, often compared to the Israeli Lavi project and the F-16. The Z-10 attack helicopter, where development involved European firms like Airbus and Augusta-Westland, and where U.S. companies like Pratt and Whitney Canada got hit with huge fines for illegally exporting sensitive engine control software. Plus, reports of an Apache helicopter being photographed in China.
It's quite a list. And Russia seems particularly unhappy about some of this.
Increasingly so, according to the sources. They mentioned China's J-15 carrier jet being directly derived from an Su-33 prototype bought from Ukraine, not Russia, and China's HQ-9 and HQ-15 air defense systems are widely seen as copies or derivatives of Russia's S-300 and S-400.
Tensions there.
Yeah. Russia reportedly even halted S-400 deliveries after 2020. And their state arms export agency has publicly complained about hundreds of instances of China allegedly copying Russian tech without authorization, especially engines.
So it's not just finished product, but also stealing underlying technical data.
Exactly. The espionage described goes beyond just getting hardware. It includes cyber theft of research data, material science, aerodynamics, all sorts of foundational stuff from universities and companies in the West. The Su Bin case is one example. There are also suggestions that programs like China's Thousand Talents initiative might be exploited to acquire expertise and sensitive information.
It sounds like a multi-pronged approach to accelerate development, even if controversial. But the sources also say it's not all smooth sailing for China's military tech. There are challenges.
That's a really important part of the picture, yeah. It's not just a story of unchecked perfect progress. The material highlights persistent issues with quality control in Chinese manufacturing.
Like what?
Well, difficulties in maintaining consistent quality, especially for complex systems needing regular upgrades, compared to just making a batch of something once. They cite things like reported declines in China's arms, export competitiveness, reliability problems with some small arms, even anecdotes about drones having high failure rates. One source used the phrase falling like flies.
And there's one specific area repeatedly mentioned as a major weakness.
Yes. Engines. High-performance jet and helicopter engines. This comes up again and again in the sources as a critical bottleneck.
They struggle to build their own top-tier engines.
Apparently, yes. Designing and reliably mass-producing engines that match the best Western ones seems to be a persistent challenge. This often forces reliance on foreign designs bought legally or perhaps reverse-engineered, which sometimes don't quite match the performance of the originals.
And that impacts the aircraft themselves.
Absolutely. It can limit key performance factors, things like thrust-to-weight ratio, service ceiling, fuel efficiency, maneuverability. So even if an airframe looks very advanced, the engine limitation might mean it's not quite as capable overall as its Western counterpart.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together now, the development of things like HMP, the focus on information war and surprise, the tech acquisition methods, these underlying challenges. What's the big picture takeaway regarding global power shifts and preparedness?
Well, the sources definitely paint a picture of a very rapid, very determined Chinese military buildup. Fastest growing navy, rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal, huge investment in missiles, and this relentless focus on intelligentized warfare, AI, cyber, EM spectrum dominance.
And how do the U.S. and its allies look in comparison, according to this material?
The analyses presented often suggest the U.S. and allies are perhaps struggling to keep pace or adapt quickly enough. There are mentions of potential shortfalls in munitions for a long fight, concerns about supply chain fragility, especially reliance on critical minerals that China dominates.
Like the recent export restrictions they used.
Exactly. That's highlighted as an example. Plus, results from war games that reportedly show the U.S. burning through missile stocks very quickly, and general concerns about the health of the defense industrial base in the U.S. and Europe.
So, looking forward, what kind of future scenarios do these sources suggest?
It's kind of a fork in the road as presented here. On one hand, maybe the U.S. and allies make the necessary investments, reforms, strengthen alliances, and manage to blunt China's advantages.
And the other path?
The other, which some sources seem to imply is more likely on the current trajectory, is that China maintains its momentum. and potentially feels emboldened to act maybe regarding Taiwan during a window where they perceive the U.S. and allies aren't fully prepared or able to intervene effectively, leading to conflict when the U.S. is potentially caught off guard or ill-equipped for that specific fight.
It certainly sounds like, based on this material, we're in a new, potentially more dangerous era of competition.
That's definitely the vibe coming from some of these reports. The emergence of capabilities like empath, coupled with doctrines that emphasize surprise and information dominance. It feels like a real shift. Some analysts draw parallels, comparing the potential shock of an electronic Pearl Harbor to the actual Pearl Harbor, or the wake-up call of the Starfish test. Given the tensions and the speed of change, some experts are calling this period the dangerous decade.
Wow, okay. That is a lot to process.
Yeah.
We've really dug into China's development of these powerful asymmetric tools like EPI, their strategic thinking around information war and surprise, the methods used for tech acquisition, and also touched on the challenges they face and the massive global implications.
Which brings us, I think, to a final thought, maybe a question for you, the listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed about HEMPI, how it uses a nuclear detonation, but is classified and potentially viewed as a cyber weapon aimed at electronics, how does this fundamental blurring of the lines between nuclear, cyber, and conventional warfare actually change the whole game? How does it alter the calculus of deterrence, of conflict, in a world that's just so incredibly reliant, down to its foundations, on interconnected electronic systems?